Well, it's my pleasure this evening to introduce Cheryl Williss. She's well known to most of you, I would think, but Cheryl's a sixth generation South Australian and through many different lines, I understand. She's a member of the Pioneers Association. She's also an author. For us, she's the author of the 80-year history of the Pioneers Association. She's also the author of a closely related topic, Miss Marriott's Circle, a not so distant past. And tonight she'll be speaking about Miss Marriott. Cheryl was a former councillor of the Pioneers Association. She's got a keen interest in the social history of South Australia, and she's been a regular contributor to the Pioneer Journal over the years. So without any further hesitation, I introduce and welcome Cheryl tonight and look forward to your presentation.
For those of you who are familiar with our association's history, you will know that on the 19th of September, 89 years ago, around 220 people met for our first members' meeting in the Lord Mayor's Parlour at the Adelaide Town Hall. But bear with me for a moment or two while I head back to just a little, and I'll get this going, earlier, quite a bit earlier, but there is method in my madness, so bear with me. Little story. When Robert Gouger popped his head outside his tent on the morning of the 28th of December 1836, no doubt shooing the mozzies away, and spotted the Cygnet heading up the Gulf with His Majesty's ship Buffalo coming up the rear, he knew he was in for a long day. He probably hadn't had much sleep either. His wife, Harriet, was in the back of the tent in the early stages of labour, bearing up as best she could in the southern Antipodes, far from family and friends. And it was so hot, she must have been in love. Another young couple in love were John Morford and Bessie Fisher. He had sailed here earlier on the Cygnet, and she was now on board the Buffalo with her parents and siblings. Not long now, and the pair would be reunited. Later, in a letter back to England, Bessie would describe the events of that day, including lunch in the shade of a large gum tree. But Mary Thomas had been there too, and she was adamant it was another tree. Meanwhile, Colonel Light was 7 miles inland, going about his business, content with the knowledge that he had at last found the right spot for a great city. Down the coast at Rapid Bay, Anne, wife of Colonel Boyle Travis Finnis, was also stuck in a tent. She and her husband had sailed on the Cygnet, but now she was less than a week away from giving birth to her first child. And more babies were coming, courtesy of all the pregnant women now fast approaching Holdfast Bay on the Buffalo. Rosina Ferguson was one of them, giving birth while still on the ship to her little Australian girl. Bessie Fisher's mother, Elizabeth, would come off the ship a couple of weeks later to be carted up, literally, the 7-mile track where she would very soon give birth again. Sadly, not all the babies survived, and neither did their mothers, but the propagation of little South Australians had begun, and almost 2 centuries later, here we all are. But right now, boats were being rowed to the shore. Buffalo passenger John Adams observed that the 29-year-old Reverend Charles Beaumont Howard was the first to jump out, up to his armpits in water, and step foot onto the beach, eager to get on with the job. The Reverend Howard and his wife Grace had brought 2 small daughters with them. The eldest, also named Grace, would one day wed a clergyman as well, the Reverend Charles Marriott. They called their second daughter Mabel. Miss Mabel Marriott was not only one of our inaugural members, she was the driving force behind the establishment of our association. This was her idea. Here she is, back then. And here we all are together, here almost 9 decades on. In fact, this time next year, we will be celebrating 90 years since that first members' meeting. Those inaugural members, who were the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, were the influential players not only in the preservation of our past, but also in mapping South Australia's future history. As a part of their future generations, as members of this association, we carry an awesome responsibility. In 1946, Travis Borrow, grandson of Anne Finnis, and he who would become South Australia's first Premier, Boyle Finnis, wrote the genesis of the Pioneers Association of South Australia, publication number 40 in our collection. His reason, he wrote, was because so often matters of this kind are left until everyone directly involved have passed away, and the compilation is eventually done from scrappy notes by persons quite unfamiliar with the events they have to describe. Thank heaven for Travis Borrow's foresight, given the time frame I had to compile our history book. But to help make me make sense of it all, I prepared a timeline as I went along, and I don't expect you to be able to read all that. Being an accountant, fortunately now retired, naturally I used an Excel spreadsheet. But I didn't just rely on Travis's memories. Those scrappy notes he was referring to, let me introduce you to some of them. And no, I don't expect you to be able to read them either. But I'll be coming back to some of them again soon. But first, let's get back to Mabel. We know she had the idea of forming a women's club, and she wrote to the secretary of the gentlemen-only Australasian Pioneers Club in Sydney, looking for information for her to get started. Here's a typed copy of her letter. All her letters I've seen over the years were handwritten. The guys, of course, would have had a typeist. There's no date on the copy, but my guess is it was early November 1934. Instead of responding directly to Mabel, the club secretary wrote straight back to our friend Travis, who happened to be one of the many vice presidents of the esteemed Sydney Club. And here is the letter, dated 8th of November. He was inclined to think the writer of the letter was a lady, and he wanted Travis to find out before he was prepared to respond. Just as well Travis knew Mabel. They moved in the same circles, and at the time they were both working at the Keswick Repatriation Hospital. He had a chat to Mabel. Although I don't know for certain, I imagine she was also involved in the Women's Centenary Council. Certainly her contemporaries were, including Kathleen Kiffin Thomas and Adelaide Mitke, who was the council's president. And what is key here is that at this time, Mabel was vice president of the women-only Lyceum Club of Adelaide. From 1936 to 38, she was club president. But all this women's business was giving Travis some ideas of his own. Enter the eminent surgeon, Sir Henry Simpson Newland. He was also a vice president of the Sydney Club. This centenary business, they realised, would create an opportunity to increase the membership of their club, which apparently was, quote, sorely needed. Travis writes to Sir Henry, here's this great opportunity, but we better get a wriggle on, or, quote, matters will be shortly out of our hands entirely. He drops hints about Mabel. Note that this letter is dated 1st of December. They quickly write to the club to get its thoughts on the matter. And the club agrees, and it's just the 5th of December. Meanwhile, and I can't read this either, so it's okay. Meanwhile, correspondence is continuing between Mabel and Travis. Here's one that appears to be dated the 17th of December. Mabel has been taking a few days off, staying at the Rest Home Mount Barker. This would have been, and I hope I can pronounce it correctly, Auchendarroch House, the former Bar Smith residence. By now, she's pushing for them to hurry up and get an ad into the paper. She says she's returning home tomorrow and, quote, if you are free to come and have a morning cup of tea at the Lyceum Club on Thursday at 11, underlined, or thereabouts, I shall be glad to hear if there is anything I can do to help. She knew how to handle the men, didn't she? And clearly she commanded respect. And I should add, she did convince Borrow and then Newland that it would probably be in everybody's best interests that they unite and form their own joint venture club, society, association, uniquely South Australian. But quietly, she knew she could at the very least use it to form a women's subcommittee. So an ad goes into the paper looking for male members. Initially, they're still referring to the Australasian Pioneers Club and suggesting a branch of that club, using its status to attract attention and elevate interest. But they knew what they were doing. You can rely on me to do whatever you want with regard to the names of the womenkind. And if I press the right button, it's around about there. And let's see how I go here. Yay, right. Meanwhile, they put their heads together over possible contacts who might be prepared to join a general committee. At first, they meet at Mabel's house. Then, as they get the numbers, they move to the Piccadilly restaurant, which is in Rundle Street, was in Rundle Street. It's now June 1935. The clock is ticking. What to call ourselves? And the winner is, what it says at the top row is Pioneers Association of South Australia. What should be the association's objects? 1. To perpetuate the memory of those who faced the dangers and endured the trials of early settlement in an unknown land and laid the foundations of a prosperous state. Clearly, someone is not sure about an unknown land, so they put a bracket around it, perhaps to give that one some more thought, which they clearly did. And they agree to delete the adjective prosperous. Everyone seems to be happy with objects 2 and 3. Someone suggests a 4th, and they debate that one. They discuss membership eligibility and subscription fees. Who is going to be on the committee? Membership should be open to all those descendants of colonists who arrived in SA before December 31st, 1845. This would include descendants of explorers and overlanders from New South Wales in the period named. They suggest as small a fee as possible, quote, to reach those of limited means. The suggestion was 2 and 6 per annum. It ended up being 5 shillings though, but clearly the intention was to be inclusive. They may have been in the upper echelons of Adelaide society, but there's no suggestion of elitism here. While I was writing our history book, I was interested in making a comparison between our association and the Australasian Pioneers Club. And this is what I prepared, another spreadsheet. I'm not about to go into it in great detail, so I know don't expect you to read it. But please excuse me for a moment while I digress a little bit and put my retired accountant's hat on to have a look at how the fees compare. So for the Sydney Club, it was founded in 1910 with a subscription of £2, 2 shillings per annum. The New South Wales base wage at the time was £2, 2 shillings per week. So the initial subscription for New South Wales was 1.92% of the annual base wage. But only 4 years after inauguration, it was increased to £3, 3 shillings for city members. And for our association, founded in 1935 with a subscription of 5 shillings. Looked up the South Australian base wage. At inauguration, it was £3, 6 shillings per week, which equates to 0.146% of the base wage. So to get even more technical, according to my calculations, in real terms, our membership fee equated to just 7.6% of the Sydney clubs. So there you go. Perhaps they wanted to keep the convicts out. And a decade later, the annual fee for our association was still 5 shillings. And guess what? Our current annual single membership this year is still 0.146% of the South Australian minimum wage as at the 1st of July 2024. So how about that? Just moving on, a quick slide here showing the invitation that would have gone out to those who had shown an interest in getting things moving. And this one, the one on the left, is a discussion around the inaugural public meeting. It's interesting to see that John Morfett, grandson of Sir John Morfett and Bessie Fisher, was asked to be nominated as first president, but he wasn't well and declined. But at the time, he did agree to be a vice president, and his son, George Morfett, was on the inaugural General Committee. The two on the right, very difficult to see, but they were first and second drafts of the invitation that was sent out to the attendees at that first public meeting. Just more of those scrappy notes. And now, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to your inaugural Executive Committee of the Pioneers Association of South Australia. Sir Henry Newland, Mabel Marriott, Travis Borrow, and bottom row from your left, Keith Wilson, Kathleen Kiffin-Thomas, Alexander Melrose, and Archibald Grenfell Price. Keith Wilson, later Sir Keith, lawyer and politician, was the great-grandson of Thomas and Martha Wilson. Great-grandfather Thomas was Adelaide's second mayor. Sir Keith was a senator in the South Australian Parliament from 1938 to 44, and in 1949 he became federal member for the seat of Sturt. He was the founder and first chairman of aged care provider ACH Group, then known as Aged Cottage Homes. Kathleen Kiffin-Thomas was Mary Thomas's great-granddaughter. At this time, Miss Kiffin-Thomas was, amongst other things, heavily involved with the Red Cross, and she was also on the Women's Centenary Council. With another world war looming, she resigned from the committee a few years later due to the heavy load of her Red Cross commitments. Dr. Archibald Grenfell Price was an academic, geographer, historian, and I've attached a different portrait of him here as this one is closer to his age in 1935 and it's more interesting. According to the State Library, this one was taken in 1938 while he was leading an expedition sent to the Simpson Desert to search for possible remains for the explorer Ludwig Lighthouse. Dr. Grenfell Price was also the guest speaker at the inaugural meeting. He spoke on the founders of South Australia, but it's interesting to see that he'd suggested there be 2 talks, one by, down here, a lady on pioneer women. That didn't happen though. And Alex Melrose, barrister, poet and playwright. Just the year before, he had donated £10,000 to what was then known as the National Gallery of Australia to fund extensions which became the Art Gallery of South Australia's Melrose Wing. In 1937, Alex became a vice president of the association, replacing his father, Sir John Melrose. The inaugural General Committee of 21 included, clockwise from your left, the Honourable Collier Cudmore, MLC, Ronald Angus, Dr. Frank Bear, C. Gerald Hack, and let's not forget George Morfett. Although not on the executive committee at the time, he very soon would be, after his father died in June 1936. The photo on the left was taken just a few years after he retired as long-serving association president. On Morfett's left is Sir Keith Wilson, and next to him is Morfett's daughter, Audrey Morfett. I'm guessing the woman next to her is Sir Keith's wife, Lady Elizabeth. Two other of our late presidents were also Morfett-Fisher descendants, the two Irwins, Sir James and his son, Jamie. You can find all the original handwritten applications from those inaugural years in the State Library's archives, safe and sound, thanks to the foresight of our committee of around about 20 or so years ago. In conclusion, I find it remarkable at what was achieved in just 10 months. Mabel had an idea to form a women's pioneer club, and by united efforts and mutual respect, the result was the Pioneers Association of South Australia. And a final word on behalf of Mabel. She got a women's subcommittee, which was heavily involved in the centenary celebrations, but that's another story. Cute.
Thank you. Just very briefly, Cheryl has mentioned about her books, and the one who's been talking about the Pioneer Association, and there are copies here available for buying, I have been told. Also, she very kindly has donated her book about Mabel Marriott to our library. So that the book is available for loan if you're interested, and she might tell you where you could buy some as well.
Oh, various bookstores.
There you go, nice and general. But yes, Wakefield, yeah. Nice to have a local publisher, isn't it? So thank you so much.
It's in the public library system as well, so you can borrow it. Yeah.
So thank you so much for that, very kind.
I'll do another little plug for the books as well. If you haven't read them, the history information in the association's history book is fantastic. As part of the Constitution review, the information that came out of there to answer some of our questions was really, really good. So thank you. And the book on Mabel Marriott is just fascinating. Reading what she did in her lifetime with the Red Cross, the association. She's just an amazing woman. So we would like to say thank you very, very much, and we hope you enjoy that.
Sure, I will.
And I'll check with Colin that you have shared it.